Hi, everyone. Good evening, and thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Claire, and on behalf of Harvard Bookstore, I'm pleased to introduce this virtual event with MARIE LILY CERAT, Patrick Sylvain, and Jalene Tamerat, presenting their new book, Education Across Borders, Immigration, Race, and Identity in the Classroom. Their conversation will be moderated by Audra Watson. Through virtual events like tonight's, Harvard Bookstore continues to bring authors and their work to our community and our ever-growing digital community during these challenging times. Thank you for joining us tonight in support of our authors and just the incredible staff of booksellers at Harvard Bookstore. We sincerely appreciate your support now and always. Our 2022 events calendar is in full swing. March is tomorrow, if you can believe it. And the calendar appears on our website at harvard.com/events, where you can also sign up for our email newsletter and even browse our bookshelves from home. After the introduction, I will drop a link in the chat to order a copy of the book. Your purchases make this virtual author series possible, and now more than ever support the future of a landmark independent bookstore. And this evening's discussion will conclude with some time for your questions. If you have a question for our speakers at any time during the talk tonight, you can go to the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and we'll get through as many as time allows. The event also has closed captioning available. Depending, on the version of Zoom you're using, you may need to enable captions yourself by clicking on the closed caption button. Sometimes it's also called live transcript that appears on your screen. And finally, as you might have experienced in virtual gatherings over the past 2 years now, technical issues might arise. If they do, we'll do our best to resolve them quickly, and we thank you for your patience and understanding. For more than 20 years, MARIE LILY CERAT has worked in public education as a classroom teacher, a staff developer, and a college teacher. Her work looks at the effects of the exclusion of Haitian language and culture in the education of Haitian learners. Patrick Sylvain is a Haitian American writer, essayist, poet, and he's the instructor of Haitian language and culture at Brown University's Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies. You may also have read his work that has appeared in numerous journals such as African American Review, Agni, American Poetry Review, Haitian Times, and Plowshares, just to name a couple of them. Jalene Tamerat is the Director of New Teacher Development for Boston Public Schools, where she leads the district strategy for training, supporting, and retaining strong novice teachers. Their conversation tonight will be led by Audra Watson, the Director of the WW Teaching Fellowships. She's also known for her work in the New York City Department of Education, where she led strategy and planning to increase alignment between pre-service and in-service teacher development and oversaw initiatives for early career teachers. The pandemic has exposed many of the challenges of 21st century teaching. It's been incredibly hard for everyone involved, and educators have had to do more than ever to reach their students. And while some of these challenges may abate, others, especially when it comes to connecting with students with diverse experiences and backgrounds, will only become more important. Education Across Borders is an invaluable research for teachers who seek to create inclusive classrooms for their students. Edwidge Danticat praises the book writing. It's a powerful cri de coeur, appeal, study, and manifesto from 3 fervently passionate, highly empathetic, and experienced educators who are transforming K-12 education for BIPOC and first-generation students, particularly from Haiti and the Dominican Republic. It's the kind of book that belongs in every classroom, as it could help safeguard young people's futures and even save their lives. That's some high praise. And so now I'm pleased to turn things over to tonight's speakers. The digital podium is yours, Audra, and we'll just take a moment to bring you all up on screen.
Thank you so much. Good evening, everybody. I am so glad that, one, to be here myself, but you are here as well. I like to say to people when opportunities like this arise that there are so many things that you could be doing now. The fact that you are actually spending this time with us is really wonderful, and we appreciate you and the time that you're going to spend with us today. I am very fortunate to have the opportunity of moderating tonight and moderating a talk on a book that I have read now twice and love. I've had the opportunity to read it twice and love. And as one of the authors said recently, and I've said previously, the book is incredibly accessible and it is needed. So I am looking forward to hearing more from the three authors tonight and to hearing your questions and to engaging in this conversation with you this evening. So I'd like to, and again, there will be time. So as you begin to think about questions, there'll be 20 minutes for Q&A, but please feel free to begin to populate your questions now in the Q&A feature. So I'd like to start what I'd like to ask the authors to do first is one, to choose a piece that they'd like to read from their part of the text, and then to tell us a little bit about why they chose that particular piece. So any of the three of you can start, but would love to hear like what really, there's so much in the text, it's all you, but what's something salient from the text that you'd like somebody who wants a preview of the text to hear from your particular chapter or chapters. And so who'd like to start?
Jalene, would you like to start, or Lily?
Sure, I can start.
Great.
Okay. Okay, so my chapter is on the funds of knowledge of Haitian American and Dominican American students. And for those who aren't familiar with the concept, funds of knowledge, it's a term that's used in education circles that denotes the skills, practices, knowledge that are derived in students' homes, or derived from students' homes, and are brought metaphorically with them to the classroom every day, and they can be used to scaffold instruction that either, kind of helps students meet the curricular goals or even extend beyond that. The excerpt from the text that I'm choosing to read is one that talks specifically about some of the challenges that are associated with immigration or migration. And I well, let me read and then I'll tell you why I chose that and what I hope that people will do with it afterwards.
Thank you.
Okay. So immigration can be trauma-inducing, whether experienced firsthand or by proxy, when undergone by a parent or close relative. For many immigrant origin students, this trauma may be rooted in negative experiences in the home country or in other push factors that led to migration. Many Haitian students and families, for example, have an immigration story with beginnings in the catastrophic earthquake of 2010, while others may have initiated departure from their homeland as a result of economic scarcity, political instability, and/or a lack of educational opportunity. Educational opportunity in particular seems to serve as a strong motivator for Haitian families as they make the decision to migrate across borders. Many Haitian families view the debilitated Haitian education system as a direct contributor to impenetrable class hierarchies and widespread poverty in that country. And families will often migrate to the US in search of improved access to educational opportunity. This was certainly true for many of the Haitian American students that I had the opportunity to work with over the years. The act of migration itself can be a source of stress for immigrant and immigrant origin youth. Within Haitian and Dominican American communities, family separations are common, as children will often precede or follow the arrival of their parents to the United States and then reside with family members, sometimes of distant relation, for an extended period of time. A 2002 study led by Carola Suarez Orozco, Adam Strom, and Rosalinda Larios looked at the immigrant experiences of youth from various parts of the world, including the Dominican Republic, Haiti, China, Mexico, and parts of Central America. They found that children involved in migration to the US tended to be, quote, separated from a parent and sibling for long periods, often years, due to the difficulty in obtaining permanent visas. Those separated were more likely to report experiencing depressive symptoms, end quote. This was especially true for Dominican youth, as they were found to have undergone family separations at a higher rate than the other study participants, including those of Haitian descent. I'll pause there. I could definitely go on, but I wanted to share that excerpt because I think that it's important, as you know, the chapter instructs educators to retain an asset orientation when sourcing the funds of knowledge that Dominican and Haitian American students possess. It's important to have a more holistic, or to have a holistic view of the student experience who has undergone immigration. And oftentimes, as we can, see and understand from the passage that I just wrote, trauma does play a role in it oftentimes. And I think that, we are talking, I think the focus right now in education circles is much more focused than it has ever been on creating trauma responsive environments. And so I just wanted to highlight that for immigrant students, while they do possess significant assets, significant positive funds of knowledge that can contribute to teaching and learning in the classroom space, there are also issues relating to kind of the migratory experience that have a connection or has resulted in trauma for many students that we need to be attentive to.
Thank you.
I'll go next. Self-elevation through knowledge, a part of my original philosophy of education, is an acquired condition based on the development or reinforcement of an inquisitive personality who seeks to feel or is capable of feeling and understanding innate human suffering. Again, as a hybrid pragmatic idealist who is informed by the Haitian notion of combit, I approach education as a road not only to self-elevation, but to self-revolution. It is not an easy road for me, and it certainly was a difficult road for many of my students who had to battle with family demons and self-contradictions and face self-hate. My students who knew how to read and were fortunate enough to go to schools had to reflect on the sacrifices their parents made, and they had to ponder on the kids their age who lived in the same neighborhood, but either did not go to school or attended mediocre schools. My conversations with them concerning the students who did not know how to read require of them to reflect on their own family members who did not know how to read and how they felt about it. It required of them to think of education as a basic human right, and of the multitude of rights violated in Haiti due to the extremely high rate of illiteracy. It also required of them to think of how privileged they were to be in the United States and to take advantage of everything positive this country offered them. I also required each and every one of them to have a library card. The road to self-elevation and to self-revolution began with a sincere introspection, with an earnest evaluation of the immediate environment and the position of the self in relation to their dreams and aspirations. Our conversations were, in a sense, intense and disciplined, with a practice of trust and respect. My students knew that my philosophy was guided by a respect and love for human life and the betterment of the human condition. They knew that I cared for their well-being as they search for their individual selves in that this new, strange, and vast land that can be dizzying at times. They also knew that I expected of them to embrace the truths of their existence without expecting to materialize those truths as permanent conditions of who they are or will be. They know they were capable of self-elevation and self-revolution as long as they were disciplined and patient enough to transcend their material and spiritual conditions. In a sense, I wanted them to embrace the opportunities offered by the United States to become the people they envisioned themselves to be, or at least to start thinking about the future in a different way. So for me, this is really about two things, or actually three. It's about my own philosophy of education. As teachers, we all have a kind of philosophy of education, whether we recognize it or not. Three, it's about migrations and possibilities, right? But it's also about self-reflection. And that reflection is where they were, what they had, and in a sense tied to Jalene's piece. They bring in with them a kind of knowledge in which others might not recognize. But that knowledge, they have to reflect on it, to think of why is it that they and themselves were, I guess, fortunate enough to go to schools while a child next door or perhaps the next street could not. So this is about equality, this is about social justice. And the migration is also in terms of possibilities. While there is racism here, but the racism could not really stop them from accessing further knowledge by going to a library. But the library also becomes a refuge because some of them might not have books at home, right? Because the parents might be illiterate, right? So it is, in a sense, continuing, the kind of tradition many African Americans have gone through when schools were not appropriate, right? From Langston Hughes and so many others, that the library, thinking of so many African American writers, right? Is the library. So for me, it's really about opening up possibilities, right? And also finding refuge, but at the same time, is the notion of self-revolution, right? Do not stay static, right? Because the self is constantly evolving.
Thank you.
Yeah. So I'll go next. My chapter is titled "Tell All the Others Our Story," and it grew out of research that I conducted in Brooklyn at a local community organization with Haitian youngsters, high schoolers, to figure out whether Haitian linguistic practices and linguistic and cultural practices mattered to them. I'll read the selection and then I'll try to explain why I have selected that portion. The Haitian youngsters' voices I highlighted in this essay made comments that are consistent with the views of educational scholars like Lisa Delpit, Sean Ginwright, and others about missed opportunities by schools to engage all children with a multicultural curriculum. The Haitian children thirst for curricula that offer and include perspectives and experiences beyond a Western Eurocentric epistemology. In excluding Haitian epistemology and Haitian language, culture, and history, schools fail to help these children build on their ways of knowing and experiences and develop pride in their Haitian identity or as descendants of Africans. In addition to learning about the emancipation of the American slaves in 1863 by President Abraham Lincoln, Black children should learn versions of history that illustrate the resistance of their African ancestors to the brutal and inhumane system of slavery, as many of the Haitian youth point out. For instance, American slaves like Denmark Vesey and Nat Turner, who resisted the system and sought opportunities to liberate their fellow slaves, ought to be featured as heroes in American history, not simply appear as footnotes in text. The history of slavery and slave resistance in America must also be part of the larger American story, part of the American democratic project that involves all citizens. History lessons could cover the anti-slavery Haitian Revolution, followed by independence in 1804, when African slaves and their descendants on colonial French settlement, present-day Haiti, overturned the system of slavery. this victory for human rights achieved by the slaves over their masters represents a significant milestone in the transatlantic history of slavery in the New World. It embodies humanistic ideals such as the equality of all and, quote, the unalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, end quote, that are foundational to American democracy. The Haitian accomplishment inspired many oppressed communities throughout the Western Hemisphere to advocate for freedom, from the South American liberator Simon Bolivar to the Black American abolitionist Frederick Douglass. Exposure to the Haitian slaves' historical triumph over human bondage, coupled with core values like democracy and equality at the foundation of America, can serve to deepen students' understanding of human rights. All learners can draw inspiration from the visions and accomplishments of great Americans like Abraham Lincoln, Harriet Tubman, Frederick Douglass, or the Haitian liberator Jean-Jacques Dessalines. All these leaders believe in the common humanity of all, children, women, and men, and the rights of all people to live free in a world where they are respected and protected. And why this segment? To share with future readers or people who've read already. I think it places Haiti in the midst of world history as really having accomplished something extraordinary for humanity, not just for Haitians, but for the world. Because there are no other historical stories where you have human people in bondage overturning the system, reclaiming or demanding or regaining their humanity. And I think whether you're a white child, a blue child, a black child, you name it, if you are in history classes and you are learning about people who are fighting, who's resisting oppression and overcome oppression, it would inspire you. So I think it gave me an opportunity to place Haiti in the middle of world history and to, to be able to, so teachers can use that in their lesson to inspire all children to the idea of freedom and equality and human rights.
Thank you to all three of you. So in my reading of the book, one of the things that came across very clearly is this notion of democracy and the importance of democracy. And so I'd like you all to think about, or to talk with us about this notion of democracy, and how would you talk to teachers now about the work that they need to do in classrooms, considering how fraught some of the issues are today in teaching about, so just name it, critical race theory is as one of them, but teaching all aspects of our history. So one, what would we say to teachers of today? And Jalene, also for you in your work as a teacher educator, what is it that we need to say to future educators about really thinking about this notion of democracy and how we do this work in the context of working with kids who are immigrant students, specifically Latinx and Haitian students?
I'll take a bite out of that. I mean, democracy is a fraught and new concept, and I would argue that the tendency is for people to be dictatorial, autocratic. And of course, the classroom sort of lends itself to that, especially when you have this so-called, sort of authoritarian, or at least this knowledgeable figure, right? So power could easily be manipulated, mistreated, and as we see throughout the world. And to me, democracy is a process in which we have to constantly be working at it. Otherwise, we will sort of fall back to our lesser angels, right?
Yes.
Right. And it very, very easily, and also given, at the K-12 level, and especially sort of middle to high school, when children, particularly the boys, are trying to mark territories. And of course, as social beings, that's what we do. We mark territories, we create cliques. But to be democratic, to be open, that's a lot of work, right? It is a lot of work. And I think that's why there's so much resistance to change at sort of public school, universities as well, right? We do not want to learn about something that is uncomfortable, right? The past. We refuse to unsilence the past. We refuse to allow those who are serving us to be at the table with us, right? So to me, democracy is something in which I'm still trying to grapple with. I'm still trying to be as much of a Democrat as I possibly can. Even with our 10-year-old who wants to sort of share in terms of decision making, but it's a process, right? And sometimes it is challenging that you have to answer to so-called younger folks about your decisions, or parents, why we're choosing this book and not others. So democracy is at the core of education. And if we were to think in terms of, say lastly, Plato's Republic, this conversation, right? In essence, it is about democracy. It's about, sort of learning different ways, acquiring different forms of knowledge through exchange or exchanges. And it cannot be sort of top down all the time. And then I am the authority and therefore you be quiet, and I'll stop there.
Thank you.
Yeah, I can jump in and say that the Funds of Knowledge classroom, like I write a little bit about third space in my chapter. The Funds of Knowledge classroom is by nature a democratic classroom. It's a space where that dynamic of teacher-student kind of is flipped. And one of the things that Funds of Knowledge pedagogy is predicated on is the establishment of confianza, which is a word that describes mutual trust that's embedded in relationships. If you are engaging in a learning relationship between teacher and student, or student and student, that has confianza at its core, you understand that you are kind of that you have shared mutuality. There's reciprocity. I'm not coming in expecting you to perform as I command you to, but I want you to kind of to share with me about who you are and what you need to learn. And I also share with you a bit about who I am and what I need you to learn and what I can learn from you as well. So I think that in that regard, the third space of a Funds of Knowledge classroom is one that can very well model the kinds of activities, the skills, the relationships that a well-functioning democracy would have embedded in it. So this is the testing ground or the training ground for what society can look like. It's a transformative space where we can imagine possibilities and leverage, our established relationships or our developing relationships to be able to imagine and create a new and better world.
Thank you. Wait, you're muted.
It all has been said, but I think at the heart of democracy is social equality. And I do believe that Haiti and the United States in the New World or in the modern world are two of the major examples of what happened when you try to create an egalitarian society. So I'm still very hopeful about those two democratic projects still ongoing. Certainly, Haiti is a project. It's fighting to crystallize where it needs to be, and so is the United States. We are still an imperfect union. But I think so. The idea of democracy, you can use both, teachers can use both the United States and Haiti as example and beacons of what can happen when you're trying to establish an equal society.
Thank you all for those answers. I know as I read the book, one of the things that I struggle with, and I know that many I struggle with, is working with teachers around the notion of either culturally responsive pedagogy, culturally sustaining pedagogy, these kind of pedagogies. And I think what your book does is lays very bare. Jalene, you talk about confianza, right? What often I get from teachers, particularly new teachers, is I need a bag of tips and tricks. They think of culturally responsive pedagogy as tips and tricks. And I try to say to them, it's not a set of tips and tricks. I think that's exactly what it's not. But I think your book does a really good job of helping us think about this mutuality and this mutual relationship between teacher and student, and this mutual respect that I think is at the heart of what is trying to be happen, what we try to have happen in democratic classrooms and in classrooms that really embody culturally responsive and sustaining pedagogy. And so, that's part of the reason why I asked the question about sort of how democracy was a theme running through the book, because I think it's a way, this book in its accessibility is a way of helping teachers to think about how can I do this work with kids in a meaningful way and in an authentic way.
Right.
So what advice, and I'm thinking now of the challenge of the pandemic, and one of the questions I had for you, Jalene, is, are there things about funds of knowledge potentially that could be helpful to teachers as we sort of, I don't know, we seem to be thinking that we're opening up the world, but you understand, as we navigate through the new normal, were there things that came up that teachers should be thinking about that might be different for teachers who are working with immigrant kids, specifically Latinx and Haitian students, that might be different? And I like that in your explanation of funds of knowledge that you talk about how it's adjacent to culturally responsive pedagogy, but it's not necessarily the same thing, that it really comes from the home. So it was a question that I was thinking about, and I'm wondering if you have an answer, and maybe others not necessarily connected to funds of knowledge can.
Yeah, so great question. And I do want to just say that, funds of knowledge pedagogy is a practice that centers and really requires the teachers to understand the students' culture and who they are on an individual level. Culture is fluid. And so that's one of the reasons that I am sometimes challenged with culturally relevant teaching, or the term culturally relevant teaching, because when you default to culture, you are oftentimes making a generalization about a group of individuals, and that may or may not be applicable to the students or an individual student that you have in front of you. But in terms of going to the first part of your question around kind of what educators need and how we can adapt to the realities of this. I don't believe that we're post-pandemic yet, but the realities of 2022 and maybe beyond, is that the funds of knowledge pedagogy and practice is one that is just more responsive to students and by nature. If students feel like you understand them and are tailoring your learning to them and who they are and their assets, then they are going to find, I believe, they will find relevance in their learning. They'll find relevance for themselves, like as they're in the classroom. They're less likely to check out because you're hitting on all of the things that culturally responsive teaching is supposed to be doing. Like you are helping them fit new information into existing schema in their brains that are situated in their cultures and in their kind of backgrounds and experiences. You're understanding them at a level deep enough where you understand when they're hurting or when they have needs that maybe might fall outside of your radar if you don't fully understand who they are and what they've experienced. So I think that that a new approach to teaching and learning is definitely needed in this new educational environment. I think that if we don't meet the demands of doing things differently, that the education system, which is already, I think, on its way to implosion, is really like that process is going to be hastened and it's going to be very painful. And I really believe that, that we have to move away from a one size fits all approach to teaching and learning and really tailor educational experiences to the needs and and leverage the assets of students that are in front of us every day.
Right. And that doesn't mean just do everything online, right?
No.
Like some people have substituted with it's
Mhm.
individualized because it's online, and that's not the same
No.
thing.
Right.
Patrick, so you talked about this notion of possibilities. And I think it's just a beautiful way of framing it. My father was from Jamaica, my mother's from Barbados. And one of the things that my father always talked about was people don't leave their homes and go thousands of miles to do badly. They don't. And so this notion of possibilities, how can I think for kids, it's hard. And I love that you talk about not just opening up the possibilities to them in your opening remarks, but challenging them, right? Because they now have other opportunities to press into those possibilities. How can we do that more? Like, what are ways that teachers can do that more substantively with their kids in their classrooms is what, like, I want to make this actionable for them.
Good. I mean, possibilities. So in other words, we could think of the notion. So for example, if a child, would like to, let's say, go to college, for example, let's say it's high school, for example, and the child is in, let's say, 9th grade, but the child is functioning at a 7th grade level. Now, there's the possibility of attending college is still there, right? It might be within those 4 years that the child could really catch up. But the child also must know that there are sort of certain issues, right? Delayed and things that must be learned. And perhaps you might not attend college at 18 or 19, but maybe at 20. Or perhaps you might not go to a 4-year college, but the possibilities are there for you to attend a 2, and then you build upon, because you are simply acquiring new skills, right? And so I tell my students all the time, and even at the college level, if you've gone through private schools from K to 12 versus someone who's gone to public school, let's say, so if it is a bad public school, well, the outcomes will be very different, right? And so we need to start thinking in terms of, and I like the term that Jalene uses, assets. What are your assets? Okay. And then how to keep the eyes on the prize, right? And you keep your eyes on the prize so that the possibilities remain instead of shutting doors, right? And so for me, it's that a possibility is a constant, okay? It is not a one-time thing.
Right.
You have to maintain that goal, keep the eyes on the prize, whether it takes you, 10 or 15 years, right? Is just keep working at it, just like democracy. It's
Right.
a process, right? You keep your eyes on the prize because you want to attain certain things. You cannot say, well, I give up. Now let's go back to dictatorship. I give up. It's too hard. No, it's you keep your eyes on the prize. It's constant, and so that you could attend that those possibilities. And I would link it, to the other side of my brain, which is poetry. One of the things that a person like Yusef Komunyakaa always says, right? When you're writing poetry, or when you're writing, sort of fiction or whatever, right? You are thinking in terms of extended possibilities, right? You think of jazz, it's about sort of possibilities, pushing those notes. And so education to me is about pushing the self, and the teacher must know when and how to push a child so that there is no discouragement, but is encouragement, but encouragement without giving false hope.
Right. And I think that goes back to what Jalene talks about. It's about knowing. So in her chapter, she talks about being an ethnographer of kids, right? So you have to know enough about kids, be connected enough with them to know when you're pushing too much or when you need to push or pull. So I'm mindful of time, and I do have a couple more questions, but I want to make sure that others get their questions in. While we wait for those other questions, I have one question for Lily and then a question for the group. So Lily, in your chapter, you articulate a number of sort of policies or recommendations that you have, and you speak specifically about New York City, the landscape for Haitian children, Haitian learners in New York City. If you could choose one of those, what's the low-hanging fruit among the recommendations that you have that is not that difficult to be, or is less difficult to be employed?
I would say hiring Haitian staff to work with Haitian children, Haitian guidance counselors, Haitian teachers. That's not hard. There are Haitians in all of the school education programs around the nation, wherever there are Haitians, that I think a school district can do a little bit of an effort to recruit Haitian staff to work with Haitian children. That's really one of the lowest hanging fruits.
Thank you for that. Thank you. All right, so I'm going to put off my other question. If we have time, I will come back to that one. Adam asks, one of the paradoxes we find from teachers working with immigrant students, oops, there it goes, is that many teachers really like them, but don't expect very much from them or think that they're very smart. What would you want those educators to know?
Being an English language learner does not mean you are mentally handicapped. You're not brilliant. Given time, and of course with giving opportunities, possibilities of learning in the native language, while we're adding the second language, the English second language, and others, that kids will be able to transfer the skills that they have in their native language into the English language. Having an accent like myself doesn't mean you can't. Doesn't mean you can't.
Don't tell them about what you know about Bourdieu. Sorry, Patrick and Jalene. It sounded like.
Well, I know Adam. He's a friend of mine, and he does really good work around immigration. And what I would say to those educators, Adam, is one of the things that you talk a lot about with reimagining migration, which is that everyone has a migration story. So whether you are an immigrant or not, migration is part of your history. And even, if we're looking at the Americas, even, if you go back into kind of, early histories, even the indigenous people here migrated from other parts of the world. So I think that kind of making that point more accessible to educators so that they understand that, migration is part of, the human experience. And just because you've migrated more recently, perhaps, it doesn't mean that you are in some ways, incapable of learning or deficient, even if you're a nice student and likable.
Mhm.
I'll simply add very quickly the notions of time, temporality, right? And so we migrate through time, okay? We're not going to stay at the same age. And so
Right.
therefore, the child whom you might not like might become a cook, might become a doctor or a nurse. And you might not want for that child whom you dislike to become the cook in which you go into that restaurant. You might not like the fact that this person you mistreated is the one who's taking care of your grandparents at a nursing home and so forth and so on. So you need to start thinking not just migration in terms of borders, but the temporal, right, migration in terms of your station in life. Because again, we do not know where this migrant child might wind up. And so to me, again, it's about, right, possibilities and respect. It's you do not know who this person is going to be and how this person is going to encounter you in the future. And again, that's what I would say is to think of those possibilities, migration, both physical and temporal.
Thank you. So Nicole has a question. She hasn't read the book yet, but she says that she really wants to read this book. And she has a question about, and I don't know if you all can answer this question, but we can keep this as a note. She says that, is there a plan to widely distribute it among Massachusetts public schools? So it sounds like there's a need there.
So.
And she says, and I wholeheartedly agree with her, that the concepts in the book go beyond the Caribbean islands migration. They can be applicable to all immigrant children. And that was my experience of the book, Nicole. So thank you, one, for the question, and two, for the comment. We have another, do we have an answer to the question about Massachusetts public schools? I don't think so.
Working on it. I mean,
working on it.
If anyone on the call has,
has contacts,
we would love to get these books into more educators' hands.
Absolutely, and into systems. I'm thinking possibilities. So into school systems.
Throughout the nation, certainly.
Yes, yes, exactly. And then I don't want to mispronounce. Yolette asks, how do you suggest that teachers address their implicit biases that they have about immigrant students, and which may impact, and which definitely impact how they teach those learners? So thoughts about that. And I think it's connected to what you just said, Patrick. Yolette, I'm not sure if you asked the question before or after that, but if any of you want to add anything.
I mean, I'll be brief, and then Lily, you can jump in. I mean, again, the notions of biases, right? It's about introspection. And if you are a true educator, you have to be constantly self-reflexive. You have to introspect, right? If you can't look at yourself in the mirror, if you can't think of yourself, put yourself in the shoe of the other, you have no business being in the classroom. And I'm sorry to say it that way, right? Because teachers are constant learners, and what teachers should be, constant learners. And that sense of learning, it's about learning about the other, but also the self. And so if you have those biases and you refuse to get rid of them because you think they are some kind of an asset, then you're more of a problem than a solution.
Thank you for that. What you said, I often talk to new teachers. I haven't read it in some time, but I read it at the beginning of my teaching journey years ago, and it's by Arthur Jersild, When Teachers Face Themselves. I don't know if any of you have heard this book, but basically it's the same premise. Like if you can't look, you have to be reflective, right? And I think all teacher preparation programs talk about the importance of reflection. I don't know that they necessarily model them, but we talk about the importance of reflection. So thank you.
But I would
Sorry, go ahead, Lily.
quickly, the school system that we are looking at was built with those deficiencies, these inequalities. They were structurally already misformed or malformed. So we're fighting against all of that, because you had in New York City a public school system that was created for indigent children, and eventually became the public schools, and fighting, and you had a community who post 1863 became the largest poor group of people, marginalized, not given access. So you have a school system with all of these things built into it. So the structure is wrong. The structure is rotten. So it's really fighting to rebuild. I mean, I know I'm very optimistic. We believe in transformation and we need that, but we need to really throw away the structures and rebuild that system from the ground up, in my
opinion. And the structures were set up to do what the structures are doing, right?
Recreate structures.
Right? The structure, it's doing what it was meant to do. We're trying to do something different. Right?
Exactly. I mean, I go to Pierre Bourdieu to say that school is created to reproduce society. Right. And we know what society we have. Therefore, it's really just going to the machine, copy machine. Right. So we need to go and implode and, you know, take away the system and rebuild it with the fairness that we expect, with the equity. Because if you keep patching it, you put a band-aid on the cancer doesn't go away. So I think there is this notion that we have to look at ourselves in the mirror also and be truthful and be honest and be authentic and know that fundamental work needs to happen in order for the system to function for Black and brown children, for BIPOC children and the minority children, who are most of them in the New York City public school system, for instance.
Thank you. We have another question.
Oh, sorry.
No, good. Do you want to answer?
I mean, I would simply say, you know, quickly, for us to redefine immigration as well. I mean, so for example, we are in Boston, in Cambridge area. In Boston, there are more sort of illegal Irish, right? Then we don't think of Irish as being illegal, but we think of Mexican or the brown and black. And so we need to start redefine the whole notion of illegal immigration, and so forth and so on. And also, you know, we need to redefine the notion of who deserves an education, right? So education, it's for a society, right? You cannot leave children behind, period.
Thank you. So Emmy asks, as a caregiver, I have heard about the importance of culturally responsive social emotional learning for students in schools, especially during remote schooling. What does social emotional learning for immigrant students look like in the classroom? And as a caregiver, how can she advocate for it? Thank you, Emmy, for that question.
Yeah. So hi, Emmy. What I would say is, you know, for me, it always goes back to kind of the individual relationships, right? And so I think that, you know, social emotional learning for immigrant students or for non-immigrant students needs to be tailored to the specific needs that the student has. As a caregiver, I think that, you know, your input, your insights are just as valuable as, you know, the teachers in terms of like being able to kind of share and like give recommendations for how to best support your student in the classroom. So again, kind of going back to the salience of like understanding who your students are on an individual level. You know, approaching the teacher ethnographer role as one.
I was just
as
going to
one
say
that's
that.
like, yeah, you know, you are an ethnographer, but you're like an ethnographer participant, right? So
Yep.
you're coming in and you are collecting the data and you're asking the questions, but you're not creating a dynamic where you're the authority or you're the extractor of information, but you're one who is, you know, coming to the table in partnership with the student and their caregivers to understand each other better and ideate how to create the most appropriate and responsive learning environment that'll help that student thrive.
Thank you. She's in the perfect place to be that ethnographer, right? She's got
Yeah.
an easier job than a teacher
Exactly.
who has to try to do that for individual, a number 30 different children. So I think we are at 7:59, but I'd like to ask if I can. This book, you know, was years in the making. There were things that you weren't able to put in the book. I am hoping that there will be an additional book, but is there anything that you weren't able to put in the book because of, you know, space considerations, et cetera, for your individual chapters that you would, that definitely needs to find a place in the sequel?
I would say yes. And there were also collaborators we wanted to work with. So therefore, yes, there will be, I hope there will be a sequel, and we will be reaching out to a much larger group for a much, I would say, diverse and work, still thinking about democracy and transformation, right, through education. So yes, there will be a sequel.
Good.
Yeah. For me, you know, given that my work for the past several years has been like centered on teachers and teacher development, teacher education, I'd like to dig a little bit more into the funds of knowledge that teachers possess. You know, what are the unique assets and, you know, practices that are grounded in their homes that they can bring to the classroom, and you know, how does that contribute to this transformative third space where they're working with students?
And for me, really, I guess I will align with Patrick and Jalene as well. We tend to view students with interrupted formal education as deficient, but they bring knowledge of the world, knowledge of so many other knowledges that we do not appraise. I'd love to have the opportunity to look at the students we call SIFE, like we really marginalize and limit them to broaden, you know, the things that they bring to schools with them, to kind of lay out the things that they bring to school with them that can really help transform society, despite the fact that they themselves, either for war or other natural or man-made reasons, have had to interrupt their own education. I've had to have interrupted education.
Yes. So it is 8:01. Thank you. So I first, thank you for letting me moderate the panel. Again, I hope that it was clear to all of you here that this book is a wonderful resource, I think, for teachers. I think all teachers, but specifically those teachers who work with immigrant children and that immigrant youth. You can see how knowledgeable all of the authors are. Each of the authors are. They're both steeped in academia as well as in public schools K-12. And so it is rich with information. It had me thinking about, like, what would I be doing if I were in the classroom now, right? I feel like I would be a much better teacher at this point. And so I'm saying to you, the information about purchasing the book is there for you to purchase. But if you have not had a chance to get your own copy, please get a copy. You will not be disappointed. And thank you to all three authors, and look forward to reading more, either in book form or in articles from each of you.
Thank
So
you.
I'm going to hand it back all over to our Harvard Bookstore host. And thank you so much. And thank you for joining us for this time.
Thank you.
Well, I can only echo that and say thank you to all three of you for sharing this book with us. And thank you, Audra, for moderating a really engaging and interesting conversation. And thank you to everyone out there for spending your Monday night with us. You can learn more about the book and purchase it on our website at harvard.com or via the link that I dropped in the chat. And on behalf of Harvard Bookstore in Cambridge, Massachusetts, have a great night, keep reading, and please be well, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night.